The national spotlight.
Just this week, a wildly controversial parole decision. Is a convicted killer now walking free? An all-new 2020 starts right now.
Pound for pound, one of the greatest true crime stories of all time.
This would turn out to be a notorious, surreal case.
A woman brutally murdered in cold blood.
Investigators at the time believed that Sherry Rasmussen was the victim of a burglary that had turned into her own murder.
As I walked in, there was blood.
She was literally clawing at the front door, trying to get out.
People were on edge during that era. And add to that, we were the serial killer capital of the world.
It's like being hit by a train. Just like being hit by a train. I don't usually talk about that day or that time.
How soon was it after the murder that your father and your mother started to think that maybe this wasn't a robbery?
I assumed it was going to be burglars, male burglars.
And there was another piece of evidence that caught the attention of investigators. A bite mark on Sherry's forearm.
A suspect that the LAPD could never have fathomed.
If you walk down Hollywood Boulevard, you can't help but notice the stars on the sidewalk, the glitter in the pavement, and you think to yourself, wow, this is Tinseltown. But it doesn't take long until you realize that there are deep cracks in that pavement, exposing a criminal element you could never have anticipated. And the case of Sherry Rasmussen was a rude awakening for anyone living in La La Land.
President Reagan in Los Angeles.
Today, the torch entered the City of Angels
For AIDS Walkathon in Hollywood.
It was 1986. A beautiful young nurse, only 3 months into her marriage, is brutally murdered in her own townhome.
As a television journalist, I've been reporting on true crime stories for decades on numerous outlets. And you think you're never going to be shocked anymore ever again? Well, this proved all that very wrong.
It was a huge story. It had all the elements, sex and betrayal and lies. It just gripped the nation.
It's definitely, pound for pound, one of the greatest true crime stories of all time.
Everything we always heard or was told about Aunt Sherry was about what a great person she was.
Tell me about your sister.
She was the middle sister, and she was a clown. If everything got too serious, she would make everybody laugh. She had a very unique little giggle.
Uncle John and Aunt Sherry are spending Christmas with Rachel on her first Christmas.
Sherry was all about family. Sherry was our glue. She kept us all together.
From a young age, Sherry, the middle child with that infectious giggle, seemed mature beyond her years, according to her sisters, Connie and Teresa. She leapfrogged from the 8th grade into high school, and Sherry graduated early at the age of just 16 and enrolled in nursing school.
She had certainly an interest in caring for other people.
By the time she was 21, Sherry was fearless and determined, and she moved from her hometown of Tucson, Arizona, to Los Angeles.
When she passed away, she was the director of critical care at the Glendale Adventist Hospital. When I think of Sherry, I think of her kindness and her generosity.
Sherry's father, Nels, who was a dentist, had encouraged her to enroll in medical school to become a doctor, but she had other plans in mind.
Sherry always wanted to have a family and a husband and children.
In the spring of 1984, Sherry met a young engineer named John Rutten.
John Rutten was a tall, handsome, bright, athletic young man from San Diego, California.
Sherry was so tall, she often had difficulty finding guys who weren't intimidated by someone with her stature. And I know that John was just taken with her. Sherry and John were very happy together. Sherry was always smiling and laughing and happy.
They settled at Sherry's condo in Van Nuys, and in November 1985, the couple got married.
It was a joyous celebration.
You could tell that they were in love.
She was just beginning her life. She'd met the man of her dreams, and she had a great job, and she was doing very well, and it was all coming together. 3 months later, and now it was all gone.
February 24, 1986. John had just returned home from work, and as he's walking up the steps into the townhome, the door is ajar. He walks into the townhome and sees his gorgeous bride dead in a pool of blood on the living room floor. He calls 911.
I was patrolling and I got a call to Balboa Boulevard.
Veteran LAPD patrol officer Rodney Forrest was one of the first cops to arrive at the scene.
The call was a death investigation. I thought that was particularly interesting. Why a murder in a kind of upscale part of town?
When Forrest and his partner got there, they were met with a grim warning from paramedics.
Somebody said, "You're not going to be prepared for what's in there." And I'm thinking, well, I've seen it all, so let's go see. Oh, wow. Well, this brings back memories. It's kind of an eerie feeling to be here after 30 plus, almost 40 years. As I walked in, I saw Sherry Rasmussen on the ground. She had been covered with a towel, and one of the paramedics raised the towel for me to see her face, and she had considerable trauma to her face, and there was blood. I thought after that, this is actually a murder.
At that point, Officer Forrest called the LAPD's Van Nuys division to notify the homicide unit, which took over the investigation.
It's a horribly violent crime. Bruises all over her body. The struggle ensued for quite some time.
My partner went upstairs, checked the upper floor for any suspects, and there were no suspects still around.
Investigators knew that something catastrophic had happened to Miss Rasmussen.
You think, given the ferocity of that fight, that somebody would have heard something?
You would think. It was a heck of a fight. I mean, Sherry fought for her life, literally.
That night, news of Sherry's murder reached her family in Tucson.
I'll probably never forget it, unfortunately. My dad called me to tell me that Sherry was dead. And I was like, I certainly didn't believe it.
Beyond the pale.
Yeah. I was like, no, what are you talking about? That's not true. And he said, no, it is. And then I started screaming.
In the wake of Sherry's murder, her family struggled to understand what had happened. Could this be the result of the rampant violence that had plagued the city of Los Angeles in recent years?
For myself, as a reporter in Los Angeles, the 80s was the wild, wild west. Turn on the TV and what are you hearing about? Violent crime.
Crime running unchecked, the police seemingly unable to stop it. That frustration reached the breaking point in one neighborhood in Los Angeles.
Anyone that worked in the city of Los Angeles, they knew that they're going to have their hands filled.
There are more than 100 street gangs in Los Angeles.
It was out of control.
People were on edge during that era. And add to that, We were the serial killer capital of the world.
The Night Stalker killer.
Strangled, tortured bodies were found sprawled on hillsides.
By 1986, the homicide rate in Los Angeles had reached alarming levels. So when Sherry Rasmussen was murdered inside this apartment, it sent neighbors into a panic.
It was a dark period in our history. People were terrified to leave their homes.
Residents bought guns, learned martial arts.
People had bought up every single burglar alarm in the city, and went to the LA County dog pound and literally adopted every single dog for watchdogs.
The home invasion murder, the one similar to Sherry's, is going to cause a lot of fear in the community.
People were nervous. It was certainly a shock for me.
Alan Tarsky lived across the corridor from Sherry, but he says he wasn't home at the time of the murder.
I had come back to work probably 5:45 in the evening, and it was shortly after that that the madness started. I do remember there was electronic stereo equipment right here that I saw when I came in. And that suggested to me that it was possibly a burglary, and a burglary interrupted. I put this together with the stereo equipment stacked over here, and it seemed to me that she could have struggled with the burglar, and she obviously lost that fight.
Sherry's newer model BMW was taken. Her purse was taken.
The Rasmussen crime scene had all the makings of something police call a hot prowl, a home invasion.
Investigators at the time very much believed that Sherry Rasmussen was the victim of a burglary that had turned into her own murder. Based on what investigators could see at the time, it appeared as though Sherry Rasmussen was working at her dining room table on the second level of her condominium when the intruder came in through the front door.
She had ligature marks on her wrists, indicating at some point someone had tied her up.
All over the place in these pictures, you see some of the implements that were used to hit Sherry.
Right.
The vase that was smashed over her head.
The shards had blood on them.
The assailant or assailants were grabbing at anything they could find to make sure this woman didn't breathe another breath.
Her fingernails were left broken at the front door.
Because she was literally clawing at the front door.
Trying to get out.
But before Sherry could escape, she was shot, police say, at point-blank range.
The bullets indicated that a .38 revolver had been used.
It was basically an execution.
Not a single neighbor heard a gunshot, and ballistics tests showed that it appeared the assailant had used that quilt over the barrel of the gun as a silencer.
And there was another piece of evidence that caught the attention of investigators. A bite mark on Sherry's forearm.
They took the sample in an abundance of caution because if there was blood there on that bite mark, it could be possible for blood typing analysis to be done.
I learned later about the bite mark that led into my curiosity of why there was a bite mark on her arm. I had no clue. It kind of reinforced what I was thinking when I initially got there. There was something more than I originally saw.
Former patrol officer Forrest, who wasn't part of the investigation, says to him the crime scene didn't jive with the burglary theory.
I thought to myself, this is a burglary? Burglars don't usually pick a place 5 condos from the street. They want to get away. They pick something next to the street. They don't want to be seen. It's just strange that they would pick this place.
Officer Forrest says he was also taken by the demeanor of Sherry's husband.
I noticed John Rutten. He was sitting at the table and he seemed to be sobbing. My reaction was his sobbing, his crying should have been more extreme, with his wife laying there on the floor dead. I guess people grieve in different ways.
Did you see John at any point directly after the murder?
We saw him at the Van Nuys police station, and I do remember that he didn't have any marks on him. That's the first thing you look at for any kind of domestic violence. So,
even though he was your brother-in-law, even though you liked him,
yes.
The first thing you did when you saw him is sort of give him a visual inspection, a look
yes.
over.
Yes.
Did you talk?
We weren't allowed to talk to him. They were keeping everybody separated.
Because the first suspect in murders like this typically is. Rutten wasn't permitted to speak with Sherry's family, but on the night of the murder, he sat down with investigators at the LAPD's Van Nuys station.
You didn't harm your wife, did you, John?
The question for investigators is, was he telling them everything they needed to know to catch a killer? So you and Sherry were living here in Southern California together?
Yes.
How was that?
It was fun. Actually, we also gained Teresa, so all three of us were in a mobile home together at Loma Linda.
Oh, wow. The 3 daughters? That must have made your dad so happy.
Yeah. I've kept a lot of Sherry's clothes.
Now it's all back in style, right?
The 1980s are all coming back. I remember her telling me that she had met John.
What was your impression of him once you met him?
He was very likable. They made a really a cute couple. They were both tall, thin, athletic, both driven with their careers.
It was a whirlwind romance, and within a year, the two were married. And did she seem like she had it all?
Yes. She had a new job that she enjoyed, just got married. She was a new aunt. We were really looking forward to the future.
Family was just so important to her, and you can really see that in the photos and just how happy everyone was together.
Sherry really loved Christmas.
Here's Aunt Sherry.
It was one of her favorite holidays.
Here's John holding his baby niece, Rachel.
Everybody here thinks there's going to be a baby Rutten pretty soon. I think they'd better talk to Sherry.
This would be Sherry's last Christmas.
Sherry's now showing why she's a leader of nurses.
Just 2 months later, Sherry and John's love story came to a tragic and sudden end. And in the aftermath of her murder, questions would linger.
When you're going through this process, you're pretty much helpless because you have no control. I mean, the information you get is what they give you.
Nels Rasmussen was determined to find out what really happened to his daughter.
And so were the police, who wanted answers. On the night of the murder, Detective Lyle Mayer questioned a very emotional John Rutten on what he knew about the day Sherry was killed.
She got everything going. I mean,
Hey, so do you, buddy? Hey, John, for a couple of minutes, I need you to be tough for me, buddy.
Investigators looked at every possible direction. Of course, they looked at John.
What was the first thing you saw?
well, I saw Sherry lying on, it's right in front of me when I walked in the door. I saw her lying on the ground. I knew right away that she was dead.
He was shaken up that evening. He did his best to give an interview that helped investigators.
At one point, Detective Mayer asked Rutten a very difficult question.
You didn't harm your wife, did you, John?
No, I didn't.
You didn't harm your wife. Okay, very good.
John Rutten agreed to do a polygraph examination, and the results came back inconclusive. But he had a rock-solid alibi.
He was at work that day. He'd left work, he had stopped and picked up his dry cleaning, and then came back between 6 and 7 p.m. and found his wife murdered in the living room area of the house.
Detective Mayer believed the murder had happened in the early morning hours after Rutten had already left for work.
When I left, she was in bed, but she was awake.
What time did you leave for work?
7:20 is when I left.
What time did you get to work this morning?
I got to work about 10 to 8.
In the eyes of Lyle Mayer, the lead detective, John Rutten was legitimately and seriously a grieving husband. They didn't feel he was hiding anything, and as far as they were concerned, he was not a suspect, and they told him so.
I'm usually a pretty good judge of character, but I'm fairly certain that you have absolutely nothing to do with this. Okay?
Mayer basically made a decision that night based on the evidence that he saw at the crime scene that this was a burglary gone wrong.
I believe your house was burglarized today. Once those persons, or that person, or whoever was inside, I believe they were trying to steal your stereo and probably some other items.
Why would they do anything to her? Why wouldn't they just run?
I don't know, John. I don't know. John, things happen, okay? I think Sherry came down the stairs, and I think she surprised him, and she was hurt. She was shot.
Oh, God.
And Detective Mayer was so convinced he'd solve the case, he even told John Rutten.
John, I know how you feel. I know what you're going through. But we're going to catch these persons, or this person, all right? You got to have a little faith in me. But we're very successful at what we do. Very, very successful.
At this point, detectives don't have a single witness. They have no murder weapon. They have no fingerprints. For even seasoned detectives, there's a lot of work ahead.
But there will soon be a break in the case. These are sketches that were LAPD issued.
Right.
Would another home invasion in the same neighborhood lead investigators to Sherry's killers?
They look like they're from Charlie's Angels.
I know.
So they're almost on different parts of the country, but you had almost the same haircut.
I know. I was still in the stage of shock that this could happen to my sister.
It's like being hit by a train. Just like being hit by a train. I'm sorry. I don't usually talk about that day or that time.
Less than a week after Sherry Rasmussen's murder, her loved ones said their painful goodbyes. A heartbroken John Rutten addressed family and friends.
When I saw John at the memorial, he was just ashen. He couldn't stop walking in circles and was just shaking.
And I want you to know that Sherry was the best professional in the world. She was the best wife that anybody could ever have. And she was the best sister, daughter. She wanted to make everybody happy.
You have to understand that was the love of his life. And trying to deal with that grief is devastating.
Back then, investigators wasted no time theorizing what they think happened to Sherry Rasmussen.
They looked at the crime scene. It looked like a burglary, smelled like a burglary.
Not long after Sherry's murder, investigators jump on a new lead. There's been another burglary here in this same Van Nuys neighborhood with a similar MO.
That burglary was interrupted by a woman coming home, seeing two men in her house, one of whom had a gun, and they fled, and witness sketches were produced of those suspects.
These are sketches that were LAPD issued.
Right. These composites were attached to this case. They started to utilize that sketch in this case to see if the persons that were responsible for Sherry's death were the same people that were depicted in that sketch.
Were they ever arrested? Were they ever found?
No, it might as well have been me and you.
Despite these suspects There was literally nothing that could tie anyone directly to the murder of Sherry Rasmussen.
On the surface, it appeared to be a burglary gone wrong, but not everyone was convinced. How soon was it after the murder that your father and your mother started to think that maybe this wasn't a robbery, like police were saying?
The very day we went to the Van Nuys Police Department.
That first day?
It didn't make sense that they wouldn't take anything other than the car and yet fight with her to the extent of her death.
Sherry's father, Nels, believed that there was another reason behind the murder because he says Sherry told him about a series of disturbing events in the weeks and months leading up to her death.
My father told the police about an incident of a nurse that didn't get promoted, and then she was upset with Sherry, and then so she sort of got into an argument with Sherry.
She felt that she had damage to her car, so when Sherry was murdered, that certainly came up to the forefront of my dad's mind that maybe that conflict accelerated.
According to family members, there was another woman who raised alarm bells for her, an ex-girlfriend of John Rutten.
She had come to Sherry's office after they were engaged, and I think she was sort of provocatively dressed and said to Sherry, "When this marriage fails, I'll be waiting to pick up the pieces." And Sherry said, "Don't worry, we won't be needing your services."
Just about a month before the murder, there was an even more disturbing encounter that Sherry, again, told her parents about. She was home getting ready for work and heard something downstairs and went downstairs and found John's ex-girlfriend standing in the living room, and Sherry told her to get out and not come back.
In the days leading up to the murder, Nell said Sherry confided in him that she was being followed by someone who she described as having piercing eyes.
Sherry never disclosed a name for the ex-girlfriend. It would have been nice had we had that, because we would have shared that with the detectives.
Nels claims that he told the original detectives about the alleged incidents involving an ex-girlfriend of Rutten.
One of the original detectives in this case told me personally they had never heard any of those alleged incidents, and none of them were entered into the official case record known as the murder book.
The single most important document in an LAPD homicide investigation is the murder book, and it's basically the place where any investigative work that is conducted, any step that is performed, everything needs to be committed to writing. And the reason that it's so important is that homicide is obviously a case with no statute of limitations.
Nels Rasmussen told me that he had been telling them for years about an ex-girlfriend of John's. When exactly that conversation occurred, he could not tell me, but I believe that it occurred.
But on the night of the murder, John Rutten told Detective Mayer that he didn't know anyone who might want to harm Sherry.
She's not having any problems with an ex-boyfriend or you with an ex-girlfriend?
No.
Has anybody been hitting on her, or following her home, or anything like that at all?
I would say nothing out of the ordinary. I don't think there was anything out of the ordinary.
But Rutten says in the days and weeks following the murder, he did tell investigators about an ex-girlfriend, the same one Nell says he mentioned to police. Rutten says he never brought it up in his recorded interview with Detective Mayer because he never considered her a girlfriend. And it never crossed his mind that she could have been involved with Sherry's murder. 2020 reached out to Detective Mayer for a response to the allegations raised by Sherry's family and her husband, but he did not respond. 2020 also reached out to the LAPD regarding those same allegations, and they declined to comment.
I had come to the conclusion in my mind that it was never going to be solved, and it was something that I would have to deal with, the unknowing of what happened.
With zero suspects, Sherry's homicide investigation was heading toward cold case purgatory.
But years later, With brand new technology and a fresh set of eyes, investigators take another look at the bite mark that was on Sherry's forearm.
And could that be the key that unlocks the mystery of the murder of Sherry Rasmussen?
Times like this, I just need to have tissue attached to me.
It has been very difficult to continue to live without Sherry. Sherry was like the bridge to kind of pull us all together.
For Connie Rasmussen, the pain of losing her sister Sherry is felt most when she visits her grave near the family home in Tucson, Arizona.
It's like a heavy weighted blanket sitting on you because you can't move because it's still unresolved.
When Sherry was murdered, my grandfather, he was struggling with the fact that they were unable to find the murderer.
It ate at my dad. You know, as a father, you think, you know, your job is to protect your children. And he felt he had failed that.
Sherry's father, the late Nels Rasmussen, gave this interview shortly before his own death in 2020.
It's probably difficult for people that know me that I hang on the way I do, but I'm learning every day how to deal with this. And I still don't have all the answers. I probably never will.
In 1991, Lyle Mayer, who's the lead detective on the case, retires from the LAPD. And the case is then handed off to other detectives within the Van Nuys homicide unit.
There were no active leads or items that were coming in at the time that were giving investigators new avenues to pursue.
I never thought that time was going to help solve the case, that it was going to ever get solved.
After Sherry's murder, time seemed to stand still for her family. But the decade that followed would bring a new chapter to the City of Angels.
The beating of Rodney King. O.J. Simpson, who's a fugitive.
Freeway that collapsed.
Not guilty of the crime of murder.
Lyle and Eric Menendez found guilty.
Smalls was shot several times. The impact of El Nino.
The Staples Center is just amazing. All beautiful and brand new.
Mr. Gore, the Democratic nominee, is in Los Angeles.
The Lakers gave LA one more thrill.
2001 was also a pivotal year for the Los Angeles Police Department, marking the launch of the LAPD's Cold Case Unit. That year, detectives were handed over 9,000 unsolved murders spanning more than 2 decades. Sherry Rasmussen's case was one of them.
I was a detective with the Los Angeles Police Department on the Cold Case Squad. Her case was one of the last cases I looked at.
In 2001, Detective Cliff Shepard would oversee the Rasmussen cold case investigation. Why does a case like this go cold for so long?
Manpower, our priorities within the police department.
In fact, Shepard says Sherry's case had barely been touched for 10 years.
Up to that point, nobody else had looked at it other than Mayor and myself, really.
To get started, Shepard said, he made copies of select files from the Rasmussen murder book, creating his own Cliff's Notes. Why not just take the murder book so you have all the evidence with you?
Yeah, well, yes and no. Our problem was space. We were in a little office. It wasn't practical to take the entire murder book.
Breathing life into an old case is no easy feat, especially when you don't have all the evidence. like a key piece of evidence relating to that bite mark found on Sherry's arm.
When I was going back over the reports, they indicate that a bite swab had been collected. And when I looked at the evidence, no evidence for a bite swab. So I checked with our property. They verified they did not have the swab booked with our evidence room. There's no record of it.
Generally speaking, how often does evidence go missing from a case file?
Extremely rarely, because there are professionals in the evidence rooms. There are professionals at the labs. They document everything.
To track down the swab, Shepard enlisted the help of Jennifer Francis, a criminalist at LAPD's Scientific Investigation Division.
And she had to make several calls, and several searches had to be made before eventually the bite mark swab was located.
Investigators are able to track down that missing bite mark evidence recovered from the murder scene. And the cold case team finds it here, in a freezer at the LA County Medical Examiner's Office.
The reason why it was way back in the freezer is because all those years ago it had been tested for blood type. And there it stayed all that time.
By 2001, DNA technology had come into its own, so Francis sent out the swab for analysis. But Shepard says given the LAPD's case backlog, it would take 2 full years for the results to come back. And those results would eventually turn the entire case on its head.
She informed me that I obtained a DNA profile.
The DNA profile was entered into the law enforcement database, but there was no match at the time. So it was a big jump in the case, but it wasn't quite enough.
It gave us a profile, but it didn't give us a name.
With little else to go on, this case is riding on that piece of DNA.
Once you got the DNA, did that prod you into doing any of the other investigative things like interviews?
At that time, no, I couldn't. I had a lot of cases going on, so it was as I had time. I just didn't have enough time. My biggest regret is not interviewing Rutten, the husband, not meeting with him and having a face-to-face. I knew he restarted his life and it was down in the San Diego area. But for me to just leave LA and go down to San Diego to interview him, I had other things going on. I couldn't do that at that time.
By 2005, Detective Shepard had moved on from the Rasmussen cold case investigation. 4 more years would pass before there would be another significant development in the case.
I'm not sure how much work was done between.
I can't remember ever covering a case like this. Sex, lies, law enforcement, innocent victim.
Because what you could tell from the crime scene, there was an assailant, but that Sherry fought back.
Oh, she did.
Incredible vigor and strength.
Absolutely, she did.
If I grab your arm,
yeah,
and you want to release my hand, what's very close exacts me. So Sherry Rasmussen knows this is a life and death situation. Sherry tries to escape.
The co-counsel summarized the case as a bite, a bullet, a gun barrel, and a broken heart.
Where she talked about her belief that there was a personal motive for this crime.
For a cold case that was running on empty, I mean, this should have jump-started it. Why didn't it?
It didn't give us a name.
They eliminated the first 4 suspects, but they began to zero in on suspect number 5.
And suspect number 5 just happens to be a cop.
Can you imagine that moment? After all these years, the answer is behind a badge.
It's crazy that you've been working just down the hall from the murderer you've been looking for years.
Yes.
February 24th, 1986, investigators get a 911 call to respond to the condominium of John Rutten and Sherry Rasmussen. When they arrive, John is distraught. he has just found his newlywed wife laying on the living room floor.
Sherry Rasmussen was attacked in her home, bludgeoned, and then executed, shot 3 times while she was down on the ground.
The investigators also found a bite wound on her forearm.
This will be important in the case because the bite marks will leave DNA.
But in 1986, DNA testing was just in its infancy.
Detectives don't have a single witness. They have no murder weapon.
Nobody really saw anything.
Detectives at the time characterized it as a burglary gone wrong.
And the trail went cold for 15 years.
But in 2001, the LAPD formed a new cold case unit to look into cases that would qualify for DNA testing.
Investigators had reignited that cold case on the back of DNA evidence stored here. Criminalist Jennifer Francis, who'd been instrumental in tracking down and testing the bite mark swab, had a stunning revelation. It was female DNA.
I assumed it was going to be burglars, male burglars. A female? Who is she?
Once you got the DNA, you realized it was a woman. Were you curious about the fact that a woman might have been involved?
I was curious what woman.
This could be the break that the LAPD needs.
I think there are times that we felt Sherry's case would never be solved, but with the results of the DNA, it gave us renewed hope that Sherry's killer would be brought to justice.
The DNA analysis that revealed Sherry was bitten by a woman seemed not to have any effect on the direction of the LAPD's investigation.
Because what you could tell from the crime scene is that there was an assailant, but that Sherry fought back with incredible vigor and strength.
And I thought, okay, we've got one with the gun, doesn't want to use it. The other one's, presumably the female who helps her partner out when he's starting to get beaten up.
By 2005, Detective Shepard had moved on from the Rasmussen cold case investigation. The bite mark came back to a female when it was tested for DNA back in 2005. For a cold case that was running on empty, I mean, this should have jump-started it. Why didn't it?
It didn't give us a name. It gave us a profile, but it didn't give us a name.
4 years went by with no forward momentum. But in 2009, a detective by the name of Jim Nuttall, assigned to the Van Nuys division, received the Rasmussen case file to check for updates as part of cold case standard procedure.
One of the first things that Nuttall notices is this 4-year-old DNA report by Jennifer Francis that indicates that it was a woman who attacked and killed Sherry.
And he just isn't buying the burglary story. Near the door, there were stacked stereo components, which ostensibly you'd think the burglars were going to grab on their way out.
It made him believe that the murder occurred first and that they were intentionally left there.
Nuttall and his team of detectives believe that this may have been personal. They conduct new interviews with those close to Sherry, including her parents and her husband, John Rutten.
He wanted to exclude all of the potential female sources or female individuals that were surrounding Sherry's life at the time.
The detectives make a list of 5 women in Sherry's orbit and eliminate them as suspects one by one. Sherry's mother and sister Teresa were on the list, as was her good friend Jane Goldberg.
They took my DNA. The one detective came unannounced, and he said, I'm just coming to get a DNA swab.
The first 3 suspects on the list were able to be eliminated almost immediately. The 4th name on the list was a nursing colleague. There was an indication of tension and bad blood between them.
Investigators obtained a DNA sample from her, which didn't match that from the bite mark.
They eliminated the first 4 suspects, but they began to zero in on suspect number 5.
It's suspect number 5 that grabs the attention of detectives. Rutten told Detective Nuttall about an old friend and former romantic partner named Stephanie Lazarus.
Once number 5 was developed by Detective Nuttall, Detective Nettle spoke to John Rutten again to learn a little bit more about his connection with Stephanie Lazarus.
We want to walk you through a timeline. It's very important. Starting, we believe we're close, but we'll have to have you kind of spell this out for us.
Rutten tells Detective Nuttall that Stephanie Lazarus is a name he's already given to detectives decades earlier.
I know that she went to go see Sherry, and I know that she was upset, that we weren't going to have the relationship. That's the reason for identifying her. So that's the reason I identified her 23 years ago, when we talked. One of my concerns is that was never, appears to be recorded.
And we know files.
I'm not trying to be inflammatory.
There's a certain level of frustration on our part.
Yeah,
more should have been documented. We're now forced 23 years later to literally almost start over again because we lack the documentation that would have been crucial in this case.
There's no official record of Rutten mentioning Lazarus at the onset of the investigation, but there's a single reference made in the case file nearly 2 years after the murder.
And it's a notation along the lines of John Rutten called Stephanie Lazarus P/O, ex-girlfriend.
And when John Rutten spoke with the cold case detectives, he confirmed the meaning behind that P/O.
I gave him the name and I said she's a police officer.
Not only was Lazarus a police officer, but she's still on active duty as a detective.
Think about this. You're the cold case unit investigating one of your own, and her office is just down the hall on the 3rd floor of police headquarters. Police like to talk. That's why they're cops. They ask questions. These cops needed to keep this quiet.
For over 2 decades, Sherry Rasmussen's murder went unsolved. Until 2009, when cold case investigators began zeroing in on Stephanie Lazarus, a 25-year veteran of the LAPD. She'd been hiding in plain sight all along.
She presented herself as very smart, capable, athletic. She was a Division I athlete.
Lazarus's connection to the Rasmussen case was through Sherry's husband. Her history with John Rutten went back more than 30 years when they first met as students at UCLA.
And Stephanie made no bones about the fact that she envisioned a big romantic future with John Rutten. The problem is that John has never, in his own words, looked at her in the same way.
After Stephanie graduated from UCLA, she joined the LAPD in the early 1980s. At a time when the department was striving to bring more women onto the police force.
She seemed to excel and do well in specialized assignments, but it was always competitive.
And that competitive fire, coupled with being a stellar athlete, was a perfect entree for Lazarus to participate in the California Police Olympics.
The California Police Olympics were an athletic competition open to police officers throughout the state.
Anita Ortega was one of the other few female LAPD officers at the time and a teammate of Lazarus.
Stephanie was an outstanding athlete and a basketball player. I thought her tenacity was incredible. She never quit.
She may have been tenacious on the hardwood, but off the court, Anita got to know a softer side of her teammate.
Seemed like a very nice person, always energetic, this happy-go-lucky kind of person. Really enjoyed hanging around her. Stephanie shared with me that she met her boyfriend, John, at UCLA. Said he was a great guy. I never met him, but I thought they were going to get married.
Thing was, not only was Lazarus not dating John in the summer of 1985, he was engaged to Sherry Rasmussen.
Stephanie never mentioned Sherry to me or the fact that John was in another relationship.
But entries in Lazarus's own diary seemed to reveal her despair after learning that Rutten was getting married. Stephanie Lazarus had a 600-page diary. What was the story that it told?
There were these tidbits of information right up to the wedding, right up to the killing, where she was indicating to herself how despondent she was.
Despite her apparent inner turmoil, to outside appearances, Lazarus seemed upbeat and happy.
She had a really nice smile, bright eyes, just a real positive kind of personality about her.
Fitness trainer Brian Brazzi says he had an immediate connection with Lazarus, but then just a few weeks after meeting, Brazzi says there's an odd encounter at his apartment.
There was a knock on my door. 2 female police officers fully uniformed at my door, Stephanie Lazarus being one of them, showing up unannounced. I had never given her my address.
Brazzi says it's an uncomfortable moment, and he doesn't invite the women into his one-room studio apartment. Stephanie'd shown up for reasons unknown, he says, and just as quickly, she leaves.
I really didn't know what to say or how to react.
Brazzi says despite his discomfort over that visit, the two decided to go out on a date anyway. But when he later had to break the date, Brazzi says he saw a different side of Lazarus.
The next time I saw her, the look that she gave me was like just dark and menacing, and I just kind of stopped in my tracks.
By the spring of 1986, after Sherry Rasmussen's murder, Lazarus's career at the LAPD was thriving.
Daryl Gates and the rest of the LAPD brass loved Stephanie Lazarus because having her face out there, her exuberance, her athleticism, it got people excited. She was a walking, talking recruitment drive. She even made an appearance on the game show Family Feud, pitted against arch rivals, the LA Fire Department.
She continued on an upward trajectory, and she became a detective for the Los Angeles Police Department.
In 1992, she was assigned to the Personnel Division as a background investigator, someone interviewing and passing judgment on applicants to the LAPD.
It seems eventually Stephanie puts John Rutten behind her. She marries another police officer, and the couple adopt a beautiful young daughter.
One of her last assignments was to be assigned to the art theft detail, a very specialized division.
The art theft detail investigated anything that was of value that was stolen as art.
At the time, the unit was the only one of its kind in the country, and with its rich and famous clientele, attracted local media attention.
I was a contributing writer to the LA Weekly, and I had heard about Don Harisik, who ran the art theft detail. So he reluctantly agreed to do an interview with me.
Also in attendance, the junior member of the unit, Detective Stephanie Lazarus.
Every time I talked to Don Harisik, Stephanie Lazarus interrupted me, and she kept interjecting snide, sarcastic, and semi-humorous comments after my questions. It was extremely disruptive. I asked Detective Lazarus, what do you know about art? And her answer was, it hangs on the wall.
By 2009, the future looks bright for Stephanie Lazarus. She has a family now and is working in a prestigious unit.
She seemed like the happiest, luckiest person in LAPD.
All seems great. She has no clue that a net is closing in around her.
Stephanie, I don't know if you know my partner. Hey, right.
Hi.
Sure, nice to meet
See you guys.
How's it going?
Good.
Have a seat.
It's June of 2009, and Stephanie Lazarus has unwittingly walked into her own interrogation for the murder of Sherry Rasmussen. It's been 4 months since cold case detective Jim Nuttall first opened the case file and started carefully and quietly piecing together what he believed happened 23 years earlier.
When detectives zeroed in on Stephanie Lazarus, one of their own, it appeared that they really wanted to keep that close to the vest.
How important and how difficult was it to keep this under wraps and keep it secret?
The detectives took every effort to scrub her name from their investigation. Any references to her at that point were only oblique references like suspect number 5.
You know, it's difficult to track your own and know that one of your own has been accused of a crime or something illegal.
And to complicate matters, Lazarus's office is right down the hall from robbery homicide.
So the determination was made to not contact Stephanie Lazarus directly and to collect a sample of her DNA surreptitiously.
This is where the Special Investigations Section comes into play. Now, this group, SIS, their job is watching Stephanie, following her, and get evidence.
As luck would have it, she went to Costco a couple days after the surveillance had started, and she had a drink. And once she discarded that drink, the officers were able to collect her cup without her knowing it.
And when you collect the DNA from the cup, you match it against whoever the suspect number 5 is. What did they get?
They matched her DNA to the bite mark sample.
Can you imagine that moment? After all these years, and now we know the answer is behind a badge.
The DNA is a match, but cold case detectives still have to confront her face to face.
One of the detectives approaches Stephanie one day in her office, and he says something to the effect of, Stephanie, we've got this suspect who seems to know about some big art heist. He's down in the lockup. We need to bring you down there.
Instead, it was just another detective. And so that was the stage that was set for that interview.
We've been assigned a case that we've been looking at. Okay. It's a new case.
So through the course of this police interview with Stephanie Lazarus, they are recording. She doesn't know.
Do you know John Rutten?
John Rutten?
Rutten.
Oh, yeah, I went to school with him. What's this all about?
Well, it's relating to his wife.
Immediately, they start talking about the Sherry Rasmussen murder.
Do you know what the circumstances were regarding her death?
Jeez, let me think back. I don't know if it was, if it was a burglary or something.
She's using every skill she has to talk her way out of being connected to this in any way.
Connected to the crime or her old flame, John Rutten?
We dated. I can't say that he was my boyfriend. I don't know that he would consider me his girlfriend.
The detectives were able to get Stephanie Lazarus to confirm that she had gone to her hospital to speak with Sherry Rasmussen.
And yeah, I may have met her at a hospital.
But being that you're kind of used to see John, was it everything okay between you guys? I mean, there wasn't anything uncomfortable or anything between you and her?
I don't know. I mean, it's been so many years.
You're probably a student of liars at this point in your career. Does that seem like a particularly adept liar to you?
It was gold for us because we had all of the evidence that disproved everything that she was saying.
Finally, when they say to her, we think we've got DNA from the crime scene, boom.
Because now I'm thinking I probably need to talk to a lawyer.
Okay.
I mean,
well,
because I know how this stuff works, okay?
She knows.
She absolutely knows. She knows at that point that she talked way too long.
And now it almost sounds like you're trying to pin something on me.
When the interview ended, you can hear her getting arrested.
Stephanie, you know you have the right to remain silent. Do you understand?
Yes.
You want to talk to us right now?
No.
All right. Okay.
This is crazy.
At
this point, had you heard the name Stephanie Lazarus?
No. The only Lazarus I knew was the man raised from the dead that Jesus did. That's it.
This is the case that rose from the dead.
Yeah, it did.
On the third floor of Parker Center this morning, police detectives arrested one of their own.
Detectives assigned to the Los Angeles Police Department's Robbery Homicide Division, Cold Case Squad, arrested Los Angeles Police Detective Stephanie Lazarus.
It's crazy that you've been working just down the hall from the murderer you'd been looking for years.
Yes.
Stephanie Lazarus didn't quite serve and protect, did she?
No.
When they said it was a police officer, I went, you're kidding. Absolutely kidding. A police officer committed this crime. I couldn't imagine that.
I was very shocked, but I also know how effective DNA testing is. And it kind of made me realize that, yeah, Stephanie must have committed the murder.
They were kind enough to come to our home and let my parents know that they had made the arrest. I mean, I cried because I was so excited, number one, that justice for my sister, but also for my dad.
I was so relieved and so happy and so sad. We had waited so long, but at last.
I'm totally in shock.
It was just a stunning turn of events. Then a whole new chapter begins.
The prosecution is armed with what appears to be rock-solid evidence. But this is L.A. after all, and strange things have been known to happen in court. So, you have to wonder, would a jury really believe a veteran detective is capable of committing a cold-blooded murder? 26 years after Sherry Rasmussen was murdered, the Stephanie Lazarus case finally comes to a courthouse here in downtown Los Angeles. A Los Angeles police detective accused of murdering her rival. That sounds more like a Hollywood blockbuster than a decades-old cold case, finally going to trial. At her arraignment, Stephanie Lazarus pleaded not guilty to the charge of first-degree murder.
There was a lot of buzz in the air, folks across the country very interested in this case, and why wouldn't they be? It's sex, lies, law enforcement, an innocent victim.
I covered the trial from A to Z, had a side view at Stephanie Lazarus. She sat in that orange jumpsuit. What a dichotomy from her police blues.
Your co-counsel summarized the case as a bite, a bullet, a gun barrel, and a broken heart.
Right. It highlighted all of the strong pieces of evidence.
So the bite mark, of course, referred to the DNA evidence found on Sherry Rasmussen's left forearm. The prosecution considered this their ace in the hole.
You had 4 separate analyses done, so by far that was the most important piece of evidence.
To explain how the bite mark got there, prosecutors presented their theory of how they believe Stephanie Lazarus was able to attack and kill Sherry Rasmussen. Stephanie Lazarus points the gun. Sherry grabs the arm.
If I grab your arm,
yeah,
and you want to release my hand, or get me to release my hand,
try to do this, or
you could grab me, or what's very close, exactly.
And the prosecution described the terrifying details about how they say Sherry attempted to escape with her life.
Stephanie Lazarus fires that gun twice, and 2 shots go out the backslider. So Sherry Rasmussen knows this is a life and death situation. Sherry tries to escape, and she goes down these stairs. She did not get out. They collected her fingernails at the front door.
Because she was literally clawing at the front door,
trying to get out. Stephanie was able to get her to the living room floor and hit her over the head with the pottery and hit her again with the firearm in the face. At that point, Stephanie grabs this quilt and wraps the gun with this quilt. And she muffles the sound of those gunshots by putting that quilt right up to Sherry's chest and shooting 3 times.
Then there was the matter of the so-called broken heart described by the prosecution.
Sifting through her diary, there were these tidbits of information where she was having contact with John Rutten. She would see John, she would follow John, she would stalk John.
In Lazarus's journal, she wrote things such as, "I saw John Rutten's car. I put a note on it and watched the car for half an hour. I did visit John Rutten, but his girlfriend was over. I really didn't feel like working. Too stressed out about John. I have a real hard time concentrating these days."
When Stephanie's journals were entered into evidence, it clearly identified to me that she really never gave up on her obsession with John.
John Rutten testified about his love for his wife and how he did not expect or know that Stephanie was capable of committing this crime.
Rutten said he never once promised anything to Stephanie. He described a friendly relationship that involved casual sex. But then he made a jaw-dropping admission, something he had told investigators back in 2009. After he got engaged, he gets a call from Stephanie. He reveals that somehow they ended up in bed and had sex.
When John was on the stand, I learned for the first time that he had relations with the defendant shortly before marrying my sister, and that was very devastating.
When it came time for the defense to present its case, Lazarus's attorney, Mark Overland, tried to cast doubt on the chain of custody on the bite mark swab, suggesting that the evidence was tainted and Lazarus may have been framed.
The envelope that the vial was stored in was found in a pretty ratty condition.
He showed it to the jury. Would you trust this? You don't know who opened that vial.
The strength of this evidence is that each piece was collected over a course of a long period of time, which would have made framing Stephanie Lazarus extremely implausible, if not impossible.
In his closing argument, defense attorney Mark Overland claimed those journal entries didn't amount to obsession, arguing John was mentioned only 5 times among almost 600 pages. After almost 3 weeks of trial, the case went to the jury. They returned with a verdict in less than 2 days.
We, the jury, in the above-entitled action, find the defendant, Stephanie Eileen Lazarus, guilty of the crime of murder of Sherry Rasmussen.
It was just like a rush of relief that it's over. Relief for my father that he finally was vindicated and he had his answers.
Stephanie Lazarus' sentencing hearing was held in March of 2012.
So People versus Stephanie Lazarus. Matter is set today for sentencing.
A statement from Nels Rasmussen was read by the prosecutor.
Sherry was a beautiful, talented, gifted person and a loving daughter. Her senseless death caused pain that will never, ever heal.
And John Rutten tried to describe the heavy burden it seems he will carry for the rest of his life.
Your Honor, I'm John Rutten. The fact that Sherry's death occurred because she met and married me brings me to my knees. I have resigned myself to trying to endure the daydreams about a world where Sherry is still with us. And this pointless tragedy never occurred.
Thank you, Mr. Rutten.
The judge is about to announce Stephanie Lazarus' sentence for first-degree murder and use of a gun.
Court will now pronounce sentence.
But this case is far from over. Sherry Rasmussen's friends and family have no idea about the shocking turn of events that await them in the not-too-distant future. Will a killer walk free? It's March 2012, and Stephanie Lazarus has just been found guilty for the murder of Sherry Rasmussen.
Never admitting guilt, Lazarus waved goodbye and smiled to her family as she left the courtroom.
What was her sentence? She received 25 to life first-degree murder and 2 years for the use of a gun.
There had never been an arrest of an active LAPD detective for murder under circumstances this salacious, a cold case. And once the Rasmussens stepped forward, allegations of a cover-up.
LAPD should want to know why it took so long, and there should be accountability for that passage of time.
The Rasmussens took action in two ways. One was to file a complaint directly with the LAPD alleging a cover-up to protect Officer Lazarus from criminal prosecution. They also filed a civil lawsuit against the LAPD, making the same allegation.
The day that Stephanie Lazarus was arraigned, the Rasmussens asked to get answers as to what happened in 1986 and what happened that nothing was done despite our repeated requests.
The LAPD denied the Rasmussens' allegations, citing immunity, and the lawsuit was eventually dismissed because of the statute of limitations. As for the complaint the Rasmussens filed directly with the LAPD's Internal Affairs Department launched an investigation in response to the allegations. Journalist Matthew McGough obtained a copy of the Internal Affairs file, which wasn't released publicly.
A total of 6.8 hours were devoted to trying to determine whether or not Stephanie Lazarus was protected in an internal cover-up. More than a year passed before it was closed with no one being interviewed, no investigative conclusions.
The Rasmussen complaint was classified as unfounded because the judge had dismissed the LAPD from any liability. 2020 reached out to the LAPD with questions about the handling of this case, and they declined to comment. While the Rasmussen family continued to raise questions about why Lazarus was not arrested for so long, they were certain that she'd spent at least decades behind bars. But just last November, there was a development that took everyone by surprise.
It was late 2023 when Stephanie had her first appearance before the California Parole Board. This was years before anybody thought she'd be eligible for early release.
It turns out, in the years since Lazarus's conviction, the state of California passed a new law giving special consideration towards paroling so-called youthful offenders who had committed their crimes when they were under the age of 26. Lazarus was 25 when she murdered Sherry Rasmussen. Letters supporting Lazarus's release were submitted to the parole board by friends, family, and fellow prisoners.
She took responsibility for committing the murder for the first time, something that she had denied throughout her trial and throughout her incarceration until all of her appeals were exhausted.
She showed absolutely no remorse and brushed it off as if my Aunt Sherry did not fight her, then she wouldn't have fight back, that she wouldn't have killed her.
The only reason she confessed is because she wants to get out on parole.
And at the conclusion of that parole hearing, Lazarus, to the outrage of many, was granted parole. What was your reaction to her being granted this parole?
It was a miscarriage of justice.
However, before that decision became final, California Governor Gavin Newsom intervened in the case and requested it go to the full parole board for reconsideration. Have you made it your mission to try to keep Stephanie Lazarus behind bars?
Yes. I mean, I'm going to do everything in my power.
In a follow-up hearing with the full parole board, Sherry's supporters came out in force to argue against Lazarus's release.
Moderator, we will now take speakers in opposition to Stephanie Lazarus.
She deceived and lied to everyone for almost 40 years. How can this board believe that she has changed?
Before he died, Sherry's father, Nels Rasmussen, recorded a video message to be played in the event that Stephanie Lazarus ever came up for parole.
If one looks at the damage that she did to my daughter's face, it's almost like she wanted to destroy the beauty that Sherry exuded.
The board's earlier decision to approve parole was put on hold pending yet another review.
I say expect the worst and prepare for our next step when that happens.
And what's that next step?
Just keep fighting.
For the family and everyone else concerned, the day has arrived where we'll find out if Stephanie Lazarus is released or remains behind bars.
My dad had a boat down in San Diego. We enjoyed the ocean and the beaches.
Was part of your father lost when the killer wasn't found?
I think I would say yes. I mean, she was just glued to my dad. We have lots of pictures of them just arm in arm.
And he never stopped fighting for her?
Nope, never.
And that struggle to keep Sherry's killer behind bars came to a head just this week as parole officials met for the third time to determine Stephanie Lazarus' fate.
I served as the pool reporter for the parole rescission hearing held for Stephanie Lazarus. After Lazarus, her attorney, and all the victim's family and representatives had spoken, the commissioners announced that they would adjourn to deliberate, and after about 25 minutes or so, announced their decision.
Stephanie Lazarus will not be released from prison, at least for now. A panel decided to rescind her parole.
The parole board's decision in the hearing was unanimous. Lazarus did not speak about the crime itself or express any remorse to the family members of Sherry who were there.
She was denied parole. It's most likely that she would appeal it and ask for another parole hearing every year. So the victim's family will go through this every year.
And as long as Stephanie Lazarus tries to win her freedom, Teresa, Connie, and their children say they'll continue the fight to keep her behind bars.
Teresa and I have continued to battle on behalf of our sister, Sherry.
We really have to keep her in because she has no regard for what she did. She does not have remorse.
I remember promising my grandparents that we would always continue the fight.
We're fortunate enough to have 3 children, all girls. Sherry was the middle one. But in many respects, Sherry was the one that held not only her sisters together, but her mom and dad.
My Aunt Sherry no longer being with our family has left a hole that can never be filled. The memories we could have had.
How would you like Sherry to be remembered?
She was a very kind-hearted person. She was funny.
She was just a wonderful, wonderful person who touched everybody she came in contact with.
I think about her every day. I mean, I have this picture in my house. I wake up, I see her.
I don't think Sherry is ever gone. She's always here.
Sherry Rasmussen's family filed a wrongful death lawsuit against Stephanie Lazarus in 2016 and won a judgment of $10 million.
It'll be 4 months before Stephanie Lazarus is eligible for a new parole hearing. That is our program for tonight. I'm David Muir. Thanks for watching.
And I'm Deborah Roberts. From all of us here at 2020 and ABC News, good night.
大家好，我是大武。大家好，我是 Alex。
我是娜娜想，
我是思思酱。
今天有2位新嘉宾。
Hello， 大家好，大家叫我Coco就好。我现在是一名心理治疗师。
你们是
同事。
大
家好，我叫李悠瑶。
是
是
一个
不用说，今天把他们俩请过来呢，是因为 B 站最近出了一部聚焦心理的医疗类纪录片，是和上海精卫合作的，刘洋在里面应该是第1集的一位主角。你看了吗？这个纪录片？
我看了。
你觉得 OK 吗？就是我们一块来看这个事情，你觉得 OK 吗？
就是有点尴尬，主要来自相
啊，对，因为刘洋在之前就在拍纪录片之前就看我们的节目，后来也是通过那个纪录片导演说想要跟我们一块来约这个。是你主动找我的哈？
是的
不是我逼你看这个的哈。其实今天拍这期我有一点忐忑的，我不知道就是说我今天说的这些话会不会对于一些有情绪问题的人来说会比较敏感，但是我不打算小心说话，因为我不知道哈，就是我会感觉如果我要对你也好，或者是对我们接下来的这个片子也好说话小心翼翼的话，这个是你们会有点担心的吗？
有点介意。也是一种有罪。
我其实今天我是不想要小心翼翼的。如果你觉得不舒服了，你可以告诉我。但是如果你没觉得不舒服，他们觉得不舒服了，那我就不管了，好吧？我们回到纪录片这个上来其实一开始知道 B 站拍了一个心理类的这种纪录片，我是有点期待的。后来就是他们不是拍完了吗？然后让我去现场看了第1集的那个放映会。这个结论我可以放在前面。我个人感受是它更适合大众去观看或者去了解，可能没有那么适合一些重度的患者，就相关问题的患者去看，这是我的个人感受。
就是说，你看以后觉得呈现一些问题，然后让一般的大众能得到更多的了解，但是并没有什么答案或者给出什么建议，所以你会觉得说如果已经是就是患者呀，可能看了不一定会多么有帮助。
我是觉得它适合普通人看的原因是，它让大家了解到每个人都有坏情绪。就每个人都有这样那样的问题，这是一个很正常的现象，能让大众有一些这个去病耻感的教育意义但是对于重度患者来讲，我觉得
也没有太多建设性的意见。
对，
但是这个是它的主题就是坏情绪，然后那个导演说
不是疾病，
讲疾病。对，当时有问到我当时的一些症状，然后那种很严重的幻觉妄想什么的，然后当时孩子就说可以先不说。说那些可能跑题了。
所以它的主题其实就是指的是情绪。
但是你要说他如果呈现坏情绪，他就没必要找你们了呀，他就可以找一些普通的有坏情绪的人去。
就好像是介于
疾病2个字会很刺耳。
这个很复杂的问题，
既刺耳又不刺耳。
对，有时候我希望别人说我有这种情况是因为我得病了，但是我又觉得我得病好像又不想听了。就是很
因为从他的标题以及前面我们讨论的来看，他们就是想规避疾病这个问题，然后想要把它解释成一种坏情绪。但是我就在思考，这种表达好还是不好？因为我的感觉就是，它如果就是一个疾病，那我们就把它当成一个，就跟骨折一样，跟我阑尾炎一样，它就是一个疾病。有精神疾病也是一件可能很多人都会有，只是说严重性的问题。有些人可能是精神感冒，有些人可能是精神阑尾炎，有的人可能是精神肺炎这种之类的。所以我想知道你本人的感受舒不舒服，以及就是说对于这件事的态度，然后我们可能才能真正的去考虑这件事情。
就是更希望是坏情绪，还是更希望以疾病的形式表达？对。如果客观来看，我肯定是喜欢以疾病的方式来表达。但是这个坏情绪好像就是有点委婉。
那我想说一个，其实就是大武刚才讲那个很重要，就是他是把它说作念作坏情绪，但它其实展现的是很严重的，这个信息传递的是，就是如果说严重一点的话，它是错误的。
对，因为我觉得像他片头这样呈现的这些问题的话，它就应该叫有关系。
是这样的，
是很严重的坏情绪啊，这个
是有关系，
就是你需要干预了，你需要去重视了。
我讲一下，就是从医生的角度，抑郁症它并不是一般的坏情绪，我觉得这一点很重要，因为很多人会说现在谁没有一点坏情绪，然后大家都会有抑郁症，这种表达其实会稀释了真正的患者的痛苦。从经典的抑郁症来讲，那种痛苦并不是我们一般的痛苦的一个加强版。比如说我们也会就什么也不想干，比如说但是这种忧郁型抑郁的什么都不想干，他会说就是从心里面冒出来的那种觉得没意思，就那种没意思的体验和我们一般的那种没意思的体验，它并不只是有这种
与发作是不一样的感受。
就是如果你把它说的太轻了，其实就稀释了真正的痛苦。
当然我们就是在这儿指指点点随口一说哈，因为其实执行方来说他有很多要考虑的。
当然是的，所以我
对方便问吧，就是你妈妈有做过心理咨询吗？她的这个个体咨询，
个体没有，家庭做的比较多。
这个场景是非常有冲突性的，平时也是这样的。
当时特别严重，就是我那段时间我跟我妈状态特别糟。
哦，但是这个已经是你病情反复1-2年之后的状态了吗？比如说你第一次出现比较严重的这种自伤的这种现象之后，到这个状态是中间持续了多久？
第一次是初2的时候，是16年。
哦，那如果是说你的状态是这样了，然后你父母也很明白你的情况，我感觉妈妈在说这样的话很容易刺激到你。
妈妈前半段的那个话其实是说，我其实也扛不住了，一个又一个的这个话题出来。
因为就是我想死，我说了一遍又一遍，我说的次数多了，他们就对，就是拉回来。
就是说你说了一遍又一遍，但是又没有发生很严重的一些恶性事件，他们就觉得好像你就是只要有坏情绪了，你就随口一说这件事儿，他们就不那么当回事儿，是这样。
觉得调动起来自己那个严阵以待的那个，
对，
太累了，
太累了，接不住。
对我妈当时问我的咨询师一句话，就是难道她每次说她情绪不好，我们都得一遍一遍去支持她吗？然后那个咨询师说，是的，每次都要，就怕万一。
那我听到这个话，我也会觉得很困扰。
但是我想就是说一点，就是在这个自杀、自伤啊这个问题当中，既往自杀次数是一个非常敏感的一个指标，所以我们确实是告诫父母，就是要每一次都接住他。
开始的时候妈妈肯定是非常应激的，但是一次一次应激，所以经常说妈妈就熟悉了。但是阔阔想说的是呢，一次一次又一次，但是也不一定哪一次。
是，而且你皮了对于我的刺激更大。说实话，就你皮了之后，我会想说，我是不是真的要行动，你才能看到？
在家里，我在加强一会儿
你们太懂了。
但是我想谈的是，当这个事情如何去实施，就是说，因为大家都是人，对于一个父母来讲，你的孩子跟你说他想死，比你自己想死，其实更难受。所以有一个可行的方法，就是父母也需要得到支持。
对，
是的，
父母不是最后一步了。所以最开始阔阔问说，妈妈有没有自己做这些咨询？
所以妈妈做咨询的目的，你们一直问这个的原因是你觉得她需要支持，而不是说你觉得她需要
矫正。我不是说对，不是就是也需要矫正，也需要支持。没有支持，矫正是不能够实现的。所以我想说，就是在家庭治疗里和三方会谈是不一样的。如果是一个真正的家庭治疗，其实我们是中立的，就并不是说这里是一个患者，这里是一个患者的爸爸，这一个患者的妈妈，治疗师和爸爸和妈妈一起使劲儿，然后来帮助这个患者，不是这样的，而是说这是一个治疗师，这是一个孩子，这是一个爸爸，这是一个妈妈，治疗师基本对3个人是等距的，保持中立的，并不是说对不联盟。
刚才你还说到一个掌控感哈，我觉得这一点也体现得挺明显的，就是妈妈也渴望被理解，孩子也渴望被理解，但是这个被理解背后其实是有控制在的，就是我希望你按照我想的方式这样去理解我，大家还是在争夺这个控制权。
是这肯定的。
你会觉得你跟你妈比较像吗？
对，特别像。
其实这是特别常见的，就是我们之所以在家庭中就是有很多的冲突，是因为我们真的是他的孩子，我们非常像，然后就产生了刚才阔阔说的这个争夺，然后这是一个无意识的争夺，并不是说大家在心里打着小算盘说我要怎么战胜你。
对。
但是同时悠扬说了几句话，然后包括里面我们会感受到，其实他和妈妈的关系又很紧密，其实人家关系很好。
对，他们俩关系挺好的。
对，这个好是需要定义的。我们有一个词叫做共生关系，就是我们的好是要适度的，就是太近了不行，太远了也不行。
好是指彼此很爱对方，
对，
很爱对方，
是真心为对方着想这种。
是的。
但是不好也是那个表面上的这种
对方式上，
这一点我特别能理解，因为我看的时候完全代入，当然我没有资格代入他，但是我完全代入他妈妈和这个小孩。对，我妈妈跟你妈妈背景超级像，老师控制，然后说的这些话都很像，但是到后来 我就是觉得你妈妈比我妈好太多了，就是改观，这就是我觉得纪录片，我觉得它这
选角
不是，我觉得不可能，怎么可能？
对，是这样，
我觉得不可能改的那么快。
他说这是他妈妈的极限状态。哎，那你当时是因为什么事儿你妈被应激了？
他可能不是很想拍。
啊，那这个我也能理解。哎，我们说了这么多，你爸爸一定会被骂的。因为到现在你爸爸还没有出来，
这个我一定要澄清一下。当时去上海了，我爸没有去，仅此而已。而且当时家庭治疗的时候，我爸开着视频，他们一直在那儿听着，有一个那个镜头，对，大家都没有看到。
所以弹幕一定会说。为什么爸爸不在？
爸爸又缺失，爸爸的角色又缺失了。
但是同时，我爸确实是有点置之事外，然后隔岸观火的感觉。我跟我妈就纠缠在一起。
继续看吧。
我会问贵吗？他要说不贵，我说无所谓。如果贵就不要去了。
我想知道他们做了什么，
比如说喝个水，
浮水。
他说那个水里有药，但是你看不到那个药。还有很多，就比如他给你身上弄点什么
精油，
芳香抚触。
对，就是他做一些动作，有的也有那种符啊什么的。我经历了好多。
就是即使我们说符啊，都不会是这么贵的，就是贵的一定是贵的，一定有问题，贵的一定有问题。
就是我妈学的是心理安慰，
心理安慰，
心理安慰是有用的呀，
有用的。雍和宫的守烈，
本命年，
他经过这个之后，他有好一些吗？
他得到了很大的安慰。
这个好像也有一个
作用，
叫超自然疗法。
学到了。
但我想起来，美国那边的确有让那个萨满教进医院做那种疗法的，就是超自然疗法，的确是有的。
所以我就说嘛，超自然疗法不是完全不可取，就是不应该对你造成太大的压力嘛。
还有一种可能是越贵它越信任。
当然，
他觉得道理够了，
对，更厉害。
反正就是对于你来说没有任何变化。
对，我是非常信任医生的，因为我要当医生。然后我非常信奉医学。
你想做哪个科的医生？
我想当内科。
这已经是我第三个患者想志愿跟我做同行或者同事。
我身边有很多也是因为一开始去进行了心理咨询，然后现在考了那个心理咨询的证。
对，我有很
这个上海精卫是算是最权威的吗？
之一。
跟你们比呢？
干嘛？你干嘛？
不要引战。
但是我有个感受哈，你之前也跟我说，你说你看过很多